Welcome to Farm to Stable, a science-based equine nutrition podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nettie Liebert. I'm a lifelong horse person and professional equine nutritionist with the goal of helping horses and their humans create balanced diets to set them up for success, no matter what age, discipline, or circumstance. Disclaimer, the information discussed here is based on current scientific research and is for educational purposes only. Every horse's individual needs vary. This is not a substitute for veterinary medicine or nutrition consultation. Hello and welcome to another episode of Farm to Stable, an equine nutrition podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nettie Liebert, and this week I have a very special guest, a friend and colleague, Dr. Katie Young. So Katie, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I'll give a quick summary that I've known Katie for a long time through our workings at conferences and in feed companies and in sharing ideas. But currently, Dr. Young is a nutritionist for Kentucky Equine Research, and I will sort of let you talk about yourself from there. Dr. Young, welcome.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. Just a very quick history. I got my PhD in equine nutrition and exercise physiology from Texas A&M, and then stayed there on the faculty for a few years, and then took a job in the Kansas City area with a big regional cooperative as their equine nutritionist, and they actually ended up going bankrupt. And so I then approached a gentleman who worked for Purina and worked out that I did contract consulting work for Purina for, 11 years, and then was full-time with Purina for another 8 years, I believe. And then we parted ways, and I went back to becoming an independent equine nutritionist. And I've known Joe Pagan, the owner of KER, for a long time. I'm not going to age any of us, but it's been for a long time. So in talking to Joe, we realized that doing some contract nutrition with KER was a really good fit. So I've been doing that now for several years and still doing independent consulting, and actually have been working some with Dr. Stephanie Valberg, who's kind of the guru of muscle myopathies in horses. And so have been doing some consulting, particularly on myopathies, through references from Dr. Valberg.
Well, yeah, wonderful. And that's sort of what brought us here is we were talking about this topic not that long, only a few days ago. And I thought, maybe I can convince you to come and talk to everybody about one myopathy in particular. So today we're going to talk about a muscle myopathy called Myofibrillar Myopathy, or MFM. M as in Mary, F as in Frank, M as in Mary. So, Dr. Young, do you want to tell us what is MFM? Is it the same as PSSM? Like, what's going on with MFM?
And that's really a good question, because up until fairly recently, it's been a few years now, MFM was diagnosed and dumped into the bucket that is PSSM2, because there is a genetic test for PSSM1, and for horses that had some of the symptoms but would test negative for PSSM1, they just were diagnosed as PSSM2. So again, this was just kind of a bucket of diagnoses. And then
just real quick, PSSM is polysaccharide storage myopathy. So
yes,
very, very high level. It's a glycogen storage disease within the muscles. So the muscles, when they start to work, they can't effectively use glycogen and they cramp up. And imagine having a full body cramp, and that's kind of like what PSSM does. And as you mentioned, PSSM1 does have a genetic component, and PSSM2 is usually more a little idiopathic. We're not necessarily sure why it happens, but it still happens.
And I'm sure there's a genetic component. We just don't know yet.
Right. Right. Correct.
And so usually if a horse does not test positive for the genetics for PSSM1, and is still presenting, the recommendation is a muscle biopsy. And so what you see in the biopsies for PSSM 1 and 2 is abnormal glycogen storage in the muscle tissue. And glycogen is the storage form of sugar in animals versus starch, which is a storage form of sugar in plants. So we see this abnormal glycogen in the muscles, and basically when the horse exercises, they're not able to break down the glycogen and use it as fuel normally. And that's what causes the tying up symptoms. So fairly recently, there have been horses exhibiting kind of different symptoms that are not specifically the what we typically see for tying up, with these big muscle spasms and painful, especially gluteal muscles, and sometimes you see the dark urine in these horses, and it tends to be warm bloods and Arabians. It's a lack of moving forward, some sort of lameness, kind of sporadic or mild lameness behind. In the dressage horses, the warm bloods, you see horses that don't want to really engage behind. Sometimes they have problems in canter transitions. And so Dr. Valberg was starting to really look at the biopsies of these horses. And what she was seeing was not the abnormal glycogen. She was seeing this abnormal protein called Desmin. And Desmin's job is usually to kind of, it's part of this, almost like the structure around the myofibrils in the muscles that keeps them in their nice little soldierly form so that they can contract well. And in these horses exhibiting symptoms, she was seeing aggregates, clumpings of this protein, abnormal clumpings. So she, as she was looking at this, she was realizing this is a different myopathy. So in a different myopathy, again, we do not at this point know what type of genetic predisposition there is for this myopathy. I'm sure there is.
Yeah.
At some point, somebody's going to find something. But to date, there has not. There are a few outfits that offer genetic testing, but that testing has not been validated. So for people who are thinking their horse has MFM, the diagnosis is by biopsy, and that's the best way. And really, at this point, the only thing we have is biopsy, possibly just looking at the horse's symptoms.
Yeah, and I think in one of Dr. Velberg's papers that she published in 2017, or she was the lead author, just as you said, it seems like there's probably or potentially a heritable form of MFM in the warm blood horses, but more research is needed. I know they looked
Yep,
at 3 generations of warm bloods and seemed to find a potential connection there, but the genetic test itself is not available. And of course, more research is needed. But remember, Dr. Valberg's the one who figured out all of the
absolutely.
PSSM the genetic variant, and PSSM1 and PSSM2. So if there's a way to figure it out, I have a lot of confidence that she will figure it out.
Well,
Um,
actually, unfortunately, she's retired now. So she's not actively involved in the research, but I asked her about that,
yeah,
if anybody was going to be picking up that mantle and running with it. And she has a former grad student that she thinks is going to get into this field. So we
yeah,
keep our fingers crossed, because it's a really important field
it is.
that in horses, because a lot of horses suffer from these conditions.
Yes. And if you've ever had a horse that experiences tying up or has been diagnosed with PSSM 1 or 2, you know that diet can play a very big role in the management of these conditions. And as Dr. Young said earlier, one of the hallmarks is that the muscle can't properly utilize the stored glycogen for energy. So, one of the dietary management tools that we use is to increase the amount of fat in the horse's diet and decrease or minimize the amount of starch and sugar that they consume so that we slowly condition their bodies to burn the fat for energy and have less reliance on starch and sugar or those non-structural simple carbohydrates that are typically quickly burned for energy. Now, you can't eliminate starch and sugar from the horse's diet, whether they are PSSM or not. We have had, both of us have had clients ask us, can I feed my horse a zero carbohydrate diet? The answer is no, but of course it can be managed. Now, when it comes to MFM, is it the same type of dietary management? Like what kind of dietary changes are typically recommended with this condition?
Again, great topic because with MFM, a whole different scene here.
Right.
Because with MFM, for the most part, we are not seeing the abnormal glycogen, the excessive glycogen stores in the muscle fibers. There are a few horses now that do test positive on the PAS stain for muscle glycogen. That's just very recently, maybe in the last year, that's shown up. But the vast majority of the MFM horses are normal in the muscle glycogen. And so there's really no need to greatly reduce the starch and sugars in these horses' diet. And in fact, the nutritional recommendations are feeds containing moderate amounts of NSC, which is starch and sugar, and about 20 to 30% NSC in the feed versus PSSM horses. The recommendation is less than 15%. And then the other piece of this is that we suspect that high fat in the diets can be causing oxidative damage to the muscles, and that also may be a component of these horses that are exhibiting signs of MFM. So
Everybody's mind just got blown.
yeah. And so we're starting to think, because it was back in the late 80s, I would say, that we started really feeding fat to horses,
Mhm.
and we kind of went wild with that.
Oh,
And
yes.
everybody's thinking very, very low NSC, very, very high fat. That's the way to go. But are we actually causing oxidative damage by feeding these high fat diets? And for these MFM horses, we may be. So for these horses, the recommendation is moderate NSC and moderate fat. So for warm bloods with MFM, the recommendation is 4 to 6% fat in the feeds. And then for Arabians, because we also see this in some of these endurance Arabians, and for those horses, we're recommending 6 to 8% fat in their feed. Not that this is not the total diet. This
Right.
is just the feed portion of the diet.
Right. And just as a reminder, when fat is oxidized or when fat is burned in the body, one of the natural byproducts of that are radicals, free radicals. So typically, it's one of the reasons why, if your horse is on a higher fat diet or you're supplementing oil or a fat supplement somehow, we will recommend an antioxidant such as vitamin E is a very common one, very easy to feed, fairly affordable to feed. So to Dr. Young's point, yes, it would certainly be a question that if we're overfeeding or feeding a higher fat diet to some of these horses that are already at risk for having some of this damage, it doesn't mean that if you're feeding your horse a high fat diet right now, you have to stop because it's damaging all his muscles. We're talking about specifically these horses that could already have a slightly higher risk for muscle damage, and then we want to try to minimize that and balance the diet so that we're supporting them. Now, we're not going to cure anything with diet, at least not that we know of at this point, but it's certainly we would be able to manage it and help support these horses. Now, what about, speaking of supplements and supplementing vitamin E, do you think a vitamin E supplement is sufficient, or are there other recommendations for supporting horses that have an MFM diagnosis?
There are a couple other supplemental recommendations. course, the vitamin E, and the recommendation is aqueous natural vitamin E because that is the most bioavailable for horses. Another antioxidant that's been shown to have some pretty good effects on these horses is coenzyme Q10. And so
That one has a lot of benefits.
it really does. It
Yeah.
does. It's been being used in human nutrition now for years. And just pretty recently, we've been using it for working horses, and in particular, horses with myopathies that may need more antioxidant protection for the muscles. And then the final thing we found with these MFM horses that specific amino acid supplementation can be helpful. And one of the amino acids is a particular form of the amino acid cysteine, which is N-acetylcysteine. And that's another one that's been used in human performance research. But in working with MFM, Dr. Joe Pagan with KER and Dr. Valberg have been working together on myopathies and the nutritional component of managing myopathies for decades. And so they worked together on MFM. And so KER, through that research, developed a supplement called MFM pellet. So that's pretty specific.
Yep.
But it is high in the N-acetylcysteine as well as the branched chain amino acids. And it's a very specific amino acid profile that we have seen when we get MFM horses on the appropriate diet with the moderate soluble carbs, moderate fat, and then supplement with MFM pellet, the natural aqueous vitamin E, and then the CoQ10, that we can have some pretty significant results. And the recommendation is to try this appropriate diet for at least 30 days. And if you're not seeing any positive results in those 30 days, then it's probably not MFM. And the dietary management is obviously not having an effect. So then it's back to the drawing board and saying, okay, what else might be wrong with these horses that we could possibly address?
Yeah. And one of the significant things about the branched chain amino acids, which is leucine, isoleucine, and valine, is they are useful for muscle energy. And it is thought the research in horses has a ways to go, but in humans, we know that these branched chain amino acids are useful for muscle turnover, muscle synthesis. And it is thought that it does the same in horses. Again, more research is needed, but there is some preliminary evidence that suggests they're necessary for the process. So, but it's not a matter of just throwing them in a supplement or just feeding your horse a bunch of branched chain amino acids. As Dr. Young said, they need to be fed in a very certain ratio, in a certain amount, certain ratio to each other to be effective. So there's a little more science to it than just throwing it in front of your horse. So, and that I know is the MFM pellet has been carefully designed to match those ratios. So it's pretty cool stuff if you're, a muscle geek like we are. or an amino acid geek. So, I mean, amino acids, you could spend a career just studying them alone. So if you suspect your horse has one of these muscle issues, first thing you should do is contact your veterinarian, because we as nutritionists can help you support that horse, but only if you have that medical diagnosis and we know what we're dealing with. Because as Dr. Young mentioned, how we're going to recommend you feed your horse if they have PSSM 1 or 2 versus MFM are going to be very different. So it's important to have that diagnosis and to have that conversation with your vet. And the muscle biopsies, I had a horse that had one once. They're not a big deal. The vet, we did them in grad school too, but they're not a big deal. The vet comes, makes a little incision, and uses a biopsy needle. It may look a little bit unsettling, but it's really not. The horse is sedated. They're numbed up. They don't feel it. And then they send it off to the lab for analysis. And then they have maybe a couple stitches in a place that you won't notice it.
Well, and Dr. Valberg has really been teaching veterinarians a fairly new procedure these days of a needle biopsy.
Oh, she
So
has done. Okay.
they just have to have the correct needle,
Yeah,
and it's less invasive,
even better.
and the horse doesn't need downtime, and it's just, I know there are people who are very concerned about getting muscle biopsies,
Yeah,
and these days it's not a big
it's
deal.
not.
And
It
then
isn't a big
all of the
deal.
biopsies actually, um, Dr. Valberg has retired from the university world, but she still is actually, she is the one who reads the biopsies. So all the muscle biopsies that get sent in uh, go through Dr. Valberg, and she writes a very extensive report. And then hopefully you've got a good roadmap of how to deal with whatever myopathy your horse is dealing with.
Indeed. Well, we could go on talking about all kinds of nitty-gritty and muscle cellular physiology for a long time. But in the spirit of keeping things educational and easy for everyone to understand, I would like to stop there, and I'll be adding some links to some of the very good articles that are on the KER website that explain MFM and some of the other muscle myopathies as well, that are easy to read. There are really nice graphic pictures there that you can follow along and kind of see what you're looking at, or see what we're talking about. If you're not a muscle physiologist or you haven't studied exercise physiology, it might be a little hard to picture this, but some of those graphics are really good, and it helps to kind of wrap your head around what we're talking about here. So I very much want to thank Dr. Young for taking the time to come and join us here today, and for her excellent explanation of the different muscle myopathies that one might encounter. And as always, make sure if you have any questions, you call your vet. And if you get one of these diagnoses, you work with a qualified equine nutritionist who has experience in muscle physiology and who understands how to feed and how to address these conditions from a dietary standpoint, and of course working with your vet on the diagnosis. So thank you very much. Happy riding, and we hope to see you on the next episode of Farm to Stable.
Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Farm to Stable, a science-based equine nutrition podcast. Please share and subscribe if you found the content interesting, and if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, send it to equinenutritionphd@yahoo.com.